Welcome to the Creative Chaos DSLR Essentials podcast. I'm Robbie Carmen.
And I'm Rich Harrington.
Today, Rich, we're going to talk a little bit about everybody's favorite topic, well, my topic because I love it, it's beautiful, slow motion.
Yep, it's just got that sort of magical feel, and it's one of the advantages that a lot of folks coming to these cameras never really had before because they never got to work with a variable frame rate camera, which these cameras do support different frame rates.
They do. And I mean, it's not to the point of, some camera systems out there will let you dial it in one frame at a time kind of thing, but there are different options. And when it comes to slow-mo, I think the first thing that everybody thinks about with slow-mo, especially people who are comfortable with edit systems.
Bo Derek running on a beach, no.
When it comes to edit systems, it's simply putting a clip on a timeline and changing the speed and saying, hey, make this clip run at 50% or 2,000% or whatever.
Yeah.
And of course, that's one way to do it, but we want to also talk about a couple other ways.
But if you do that in the NLE with just the traditional tools, it can look a little choppy, right?
Look a little choppy, or I mean, there are some like I'm thinking of like Apple Motion, for example, where you can run optical flow on it, and there's some ways to do it, but we have a couple different ways that people might not think of, and the first way is this idea of conforming footage, right?
Right. Well, I think before we even get to that point is if you really know you're going to be doing speed effects. Shoot at 60 on these cameras, and that's one of the main advantages.
That's a great point. Yeah. So I mean, shooting at 60 frames a second, 60 looks a little kind of too real, hyper real for people. It's not something that you're gonna necessarily want to use, in a feature film or whatever like that. But one of the things you can do with it if you shoot at 60 frames a second is that you can then conform it, which we're going to talk about first. Talk about interpreting it and a couple other things to get it to the frame rate that you want.
Yeah, and that's just going to be under your video mode. You could specify, the frame rate that you want and investigate it,
Yeah, sure.
Of course, make sure you switch back to your normal frame rate when you go back to your normal shooting.
Absolutely. So on my machine right now, I got a clip that we actually just ran across the hallway into the kitchen and shot us dropping some water and some glass here. But let me just play it back. This is the clip at its full speed right here. So I'll just play it back. And it's just somebody dropping some in the water, a little ball into the water. You can see it. Let's see it one more time. Okay. Whatever, kind of looks like, a ball dropping in the water, right?
Yeah.
Now, this is obviously just an example, but we could do this on any type of clip that, you want, an explosion or,
I put in a request for a Major League Baseball pitcher, but the budget didn't get approved.
Right. Or somebody walking down a street, in a very, music video with, an aggressive pose, and you might want to get them, yeah, exactly, right? So I got this clip open, it's whatever, it's a ball dropping in the water, but let's take a look at the first way, and this is the idea of conforming a clip. Now, I'm going to use Cinema Tools, which is part of the Final Cut Studio, to conform this clip. And to be clear, what conform does, what it really does, is it literally just changes the frame rate header on the file. So it says, okay, instead of playing this back at 60 frames per second, play it back at whatever, 2997 or 24 or 2398, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this clip and drag it over to Cinema Tools. But before I do, I just want to make one thing clear about this particular workflow, is that when you conform a clip, well,
destructive.
It's a little destructive. You could always conform it back and back and forth because it's just literally changing that header. But if other projects are referencing this clip or something like that, that's going to screw those clips up because it's literally changing the frame rate header and the file and the source file itself.
You are modifying the actual source file, and that could be a bad idea. So duplicate the clip and maybe rename it with the extension speed or
Exactly.
slow.
So I'm just going to duplicate this clip real quick, and let me just go ahead and then rename it. So instead of copy, we'll just call this _ slow-mo.
Sure.
And what I'm going to do then is take this guy and drag it over to Cinema Tools, which I have here in my dock. And in just a second, Cinema Tools is going to open up. And at the bottom of the window, you'll notice right here, at the bottom here, I have a button that says Conform. Let's go ahead and click that. And when I do, it says, okay, your current frame rate is 59.94 frames per second. What do you want to conform it to? Click on here. I have a whole bunch of options. I could go straight 24, 25 for PAL, 2997. Let's go to choose 2398 because that's the frame rate that most people are going to be using for video projects that are at 24. So I'll choose 2398. And guess what? If I click conform here, it's instantaneous, right? Because all I'm literally doing is changing a bit of metadata about this clip, so I don't have to wait for it to process or render or anything like that. So let me just go ahead and click conform. And voila, it conformed. I can play it back right in here. Let's just see what it looks like now. Click play. And there you go. It slowed down the clip. Now, the one thing, this clip had audio. So guess what?
What?
It conformed the audio as well, right?
Yeah.
So when you're going for slow motion special effects, you kind of have to treat the camera as sort of an MOS camera, right? Where you don't really need to pick up audio because it's going to conform that audio as well. Now, you have another way of adjusting speed, yeah?
Absolutely, and this is sort of an Adobe workflow where I'm actually going to use After Effects, which has several different ways of doing this. So, I've already brought the clip in, and I've brought it in twice here, but I just imported it, and if you look at the clip, you see up in the top there, same thing, 5994.
Yep.
Now, if you do this, you can do the same thing in Premiere Pro. You just go down to Interpret Footage, and when you do that, you've got the ability to conform the frame rate, just like you did.
Yeah, sure.
So I could go ahead and change that and just type in the frame rate I need, 23976.
I mean, you could literally type in anything you wanted, right? You could type 2 frames a second if you wanted.
And it will play it back 2 frames a second.
Yep.
So what happens here is that conforms the clip in your project, but then you have to realize when you drop it in a project. So if I have a composition here, and this particular comp I'm working with, let's just change the composition settings. And we'll set this composition to match what you were doing of 23976.
Right.
So when we do that, you'll see that the footage starts to get automatically interpreted. So here's the first one that is still 5994.
Yep.
And it's taken about 2 seconds for that part of the clip. I can go to this next clip here, and we're going to go ahead and interpret that, and we'll go ahead and slow that down.
Okay.
And we'll set that to 23976.
Okay.
So when I do that there, it stretches the footage out a bit. So let's watch it as is. Here it is in the same 60 frames a second, very fast.
Yep.
Now let's just go ahead and drop that in.
Okay.
Here's my 23976. Put it in there. And let's just mark out the portion of the clip we want right when it drops in. There it is.
Okay.
Mark an in point. Good. And what you see there is it's playing slower.
Yeah.
So pretty straightforward.
Yep.
Now, there's multiple ways of handling this, though. What's cool is that besides just changing the conform rate, you can actually retime the clip by stretching it.
Okay, so this would be more of an interpretation of the frame rate rather than a straight conform.
Well, we're doing both, actually.
Okay.
So we've conformed it, so we're taking those 60 frames, and we're now telling it to play back at 23976.
Okay.
And now we're going to go ahead and click the stretch column here. If you don't see that, it's just a right click, and you can bring up column stretch.
So this would be more akin to doing a traditional speed effect, say in your NLE or something like that.
It's exactly the same thing. I'm going to apply a stretch factor of 200%.
Okay.
And the difference, though, is that After Effects has 3 quality modes for that stretch. So the default here is pretty simple. If we just look at that, you're going to see that it drops it in, and boom, it's repeating frames.
Yep.
So it's kind of stair-stepping.
Yep.
If you turn on frame blending up here, you could turn on this first mode, and what that's going to do is it's going to do basically a blur type frame blend.
Okay.
So that as the footage plays back,
Yeah, you're not seeing that stair stepping quite as much, right?
it's blending the frames together. The last option, if we click this one more time, is it actually does sort of an advanced pixel motion, and it warps between the frames.
Yeah, that's very similar on the Mac side of things on the Final Cut Studio with optical flow and motion, for example.
Yeah, and so you could do that in motion, you could do that here, and you see now it's literally morphing
Yep.
between.
And that's going to give you a more naturalistic effects, right? Because it's morphing only the parts of the image that are truly changing.
Yeah.
Right?
And that looks good, and and so these are the built-in tools.
Yep.
Of course, like any great video technology,
You can always get better if you pay for it.
you can always get better if you pay for it.
Right.
And sort of the granddaddy that's been around for a long time that people hold up as the standard is a plugin called Twixter.
Oh yeah, it's a great plugin.
It works. It's from Revision Effects, and it works in Final Cut Studio. It works in After Effects, Premiere, and so it literally takes the frames from one layer and maps them to another.
Okay.
So let's do that here. What you do is you basically drop in your source clip, which I've done here.
Yep, I see it there.
And you just put it in, and you get where you want, and there's the original clip. This is still the 5994. You don't have to do any conforming.
No other steps. Just drop it right there on the composition.
Drop it in the timeline,
Okay.
set your composition to the settings you want. You then make an empty solid, which is basically a blank layer
Yep.
that can hold something. And on that blank layer, we will apply the Twixter effect.
Okay. So not applying it to the actual clip itself, but we're applying it to this blank null layer, if you will.
Yeah, and this layer is going to contain the results.
That it's gonna pull the plugin's gonna pull its information from that layer.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a couple options. We're going to stick with the more basic Twixtor, but Twixtor Pro gets really complex with all sorts of.
If you're a geek and you want to tweak until your heart's content, right?
You can do motion tracking and all sorts of really
Gotcha.
cool things. But for purposes of just seeing how good it is,
Right.
we'll go to regular Twixtor. And what you start off with at the top of the filter here, you just need to tell it what source is the footage layer.
Oh, and there you go. There's your movie.
Yep. And that's in there. And then we say, what's the original frame rate? In this case, it was 5994. So it knows what's coming in.
Okay.
And then you can go into that and you just take a look at it and you say, okay, well, what speed do I want? And
Let's make this super slow-mo.
10% the original speed.
Perfect.
So we assign that, and then we've got options like, oh, do a motion weighted blend where it's going to favor what's motion and smooth that out. And even we'll do this smart blend, which is going to further analyze. It takes a little bit longer, but it does a nice job. So let's just sort of see where that first drops in, right about there. Good. And I've marked my preview area, and we'll just preview that at full quality. And is it slower? Yes. But you see there how it's precisely analyzing the frames.
Yep.
And watch as the liquid splashes over. It's doing a more intelligent sort of warp between the different positions and creating entirely new frames. Now, After Effects kind of does that, and it does it well.
Yep.
This just does it a few $100s better.
No, again, the question comes up, well, when do I do this, right? Am I going to do this before I bring stuff into my editor and edit my show together, and then I do it after? Now, with a plugin like this, you could sort of do it at any time, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
but it's working better because we gave it 60 frames per second.
Right.
So it had 2 to 2.5 times more info than it would have had originally.
Gotcha.
So and let's just watch that back in real time. Boom.
Cool.
Smooth, sexy. Imagine if that was the glass of beer, and it's sloshed at the end of the bar.
Absolutely.
Beer. So, but it's the idea. You see this in spots all the time, the sloshing of the liquid or the slow motion dive or the run on the beach. Bo Derek, yeah.
Now, there are those people who obviously argue that do it in the camera rather than doing it here, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that you and I, throughout our experience, we sort of see it both ways, right? I mean, certainly an in-camera slow motion and doing the conform workflow like I did in Cinema Tools, that does give you an instantaneous, buttery smooth slow motion. And I'm sure as these cameras develop, we'll see even, faster frame rates, 120 or 200 frames or whatever it may be. Yeah. But, a lot of times, doing an interpret here in After Effects or using a plugin like Twixtor is going to provide you a little bit more control when they have those instances when, you just need a little more out of it.
Well, yeah, and in this particular case, because we started with a 60 frame source, and then we conformed it down, and then we went ahead and stretched it even further. We're really getting a huge gain here in total number of usable frames. So I think it was a combination of shooting it right and then taking advantage in post. And so if Twixtor's not an option for you, you've got the optical flow in motion, and you've got the advanced frame blending inside of After Effects. Both very, very good.
And then of course in whatever NLE you're using, if you're using Final Cut or Premiere Pro or whatever it may be, all of those apps are going to have native speed tools to be able to adjust the speed. As you said though, they don't often provide you the same level of sort of fine control over something like Twixtor, but hey, Twixtor's available for these apps as well.
Yeah, and one last piece of shooting advice, besides shooting at the higher frame rate, if you can minimize the movement of the camera, you'll get smoother results. Like if the camera's locked down when you're doing these speed change shots, it looks a lot better than a handheld jittery camera where you get all sorts of jumpy frames. You'll really get that smooth liquid feel if you're using a lockdown camera or like a slider, so it's a nice constant speed move.
Totally.
Those will really, really help.
Cool.
Okay, so hopefully that gives you some ideas on how to tackle slow motion. Remember, what we're telling you here today, it's both a combination of what you do in the camera and post if you want the most options.
Yep. And
this is attainable by all of you. I've seen some great results posted to the Creative Cow forum of people playing with speed changes, really getting some creative looks.
Absolutely.
Head on over to creativecow.net. Be sure to check out their DSLR podcast as well as the forum there. And while you're over there, there's tons more video tutorials to check out as well as the Creative Cow magazine. Thanks for joining us.